So, picture this. You've got a ruler they call the Tsar Liberator. Sounds great, right? This is the man who freed 23 million people from serfdom. But then he's assassinated by revolutionaries who say they're fighting for those very same people. How does that happen? This is the incredible, contradictory story of Tsar Alexander II, whose attempt to drag a medieval empire into the modern world ended in both incredible progress and unimaginable tragedy. Let's try and make sense of this paradox.
And really, these two images tell you everything you need to know. On one side, you have this moment of pure hope, peasants gathered together about to hear the news that they are finally free. And on the other side, well, it's the grim reality of how it all ended. Chaos, violence, and a brutal assassination on the snowy streets of St. Petersburg. So how could the great Tsar Liberator end up being hunted down and killed?
That's the huge question we're going to tackle in this explainer. How did a ruler who pushed through some of the most radical reforms in Russian history become the #1 target for assassination plots? It just doesn't seem to add up. To really get it, we need to go back and look at the world he inherited.
Because to understand the reformer, you first have to understand the completely broken empire he was handed. When Alexander II came to the throne in 1855, Russia was, to put it mildly, at a breaking point. The place was in a total crisis. Russia had just been humiliated in the Crimean War, a defeat that laid bare just how technologically and socially backwards it was. The government bureaucracy was a swamp of corruption, and the entire economy was built on the backs of serfs. And let's be clear, serfdom was basically a form of slavery, tying millions of people to the land they worked. There's a quote from a philosopher at the time, Boris Chicherin, that just nails the challenge Alexander was facing. He said Alexander had to completely remodel this enormous state. He wasn't just patching a few holes, he had to rebuild the entire system, a system run by an autocrat, a single ruler with absolute power. It was a massive, almost impossible job. And you know what? For a little while there, it looked like he might actually pull it off. Alexander kicked off a period of change so fast and so dramatic that it's still known today as the era of the Great Reforms. And the absolute centerpiece of it all was the Emancipation Edict of 1861. With just the stroke of a pen, he freed 23 million serfs. Let that number sink in. 23 million. To put that in perspective, that's more people than the entire population of the United States at the time. It was a truly revolutionary act, and it came straight from the top. But he didn't stop there. Not by a long shot. He introduced a modern legal system with trial by jury. He totally reformed the military, getting rid of those insane 25-year terms of service. He created elected local governments. He eased up on censorship. He even abolished corporal punishment. It was a breathtaking rush of modernization. But, and this is a huge but, that freedom for the serfs, it came with a crippling catch. They had to buy the very land they had always worked, paying off these redemption payments to the state for the next 49 years. See, opening the door to change in an autocracy is a very dangerous game. You can't always control what comes rushing in. So instead of gratitude, this flawed emancipation deal created a ton of debt and disappointment, which just fueled more anger. The reforms that were supposed to make the state stronger also unleashed new ideas and new demands, and a lot of those demands challenged the Tsar's own absolute power. And you can kind of see right here how things started to go south. In 1863, there's a big uprising in Poland, and Alexander crushes it without mercy. Then, in 1866, the first attempt is made on his life. And that was the turning point. Alexander became more paranoid, more conservative. That brief era of reform started giving way to an era of reaction. He started giving his officials these sweeping powers to just crush anyone who disagreed with him. And that, of course, just poured gasoline on the revolutionary fire. This crackdown only made the revolutionaries more determined. For one radical group in particular, reform wasn't enough anymore. The only answer, they decided, was to kill the Tsar. And that's what set the stage for the final, tragic climax of this story. The group that finally pulled it off was called Narodnaya Voya, which means the people's will. They were a small, incredibly dedicated group of radicals who had this idea that assassinating the Tsar would trigger a massive revolution and bring the whole system crashing down. And they hunted him with a terrifying obsession. On March 13, 1881, they finally got their chance. The first assassin threw a bomb, and it exploded right under the imperial carriage. Now, the carriage was armored, so it actually held up. Alexander was shaken, but he was okay. But then, he made a decision that would seal his fate. Against all the advice of his guards, he actually got out of the carriage to check on the wounded. And as he was standing there, a second assassin stepped out of the crowd and threw another bomb right at his feet. And in those last seconds, you have this incredibly chilling exchange. After that first bomb went off, Alexander apparently said, "Thank God I'm untouched." But the second assassin reportedly shouted back, "It is too early to thank God," just before he threw the bomb that would kill them both. The death of the Tsar Liberator did not spark the great revolution that the people's will had dreamed of. In fact, it did the exact opposite. It plunged Russia into an era of brutal, suffocating repression. And this, right here, is the ultimate tragedy of the whole story. On the very morning he was killed, Alexander had signed off on something called the Loris-Melikov Proposal. It would have created elected commissions to help create laws. He himself called it the first step towards a constitution. Russia was literally hours away from starting down a path that could have led to a constitutional monarchy, a path that might have avoided so much of the horror to come. Instead of a constitution, this is his most famous memorial, the incredible Church of the Savior on Blood in St. Petersburg. It wasn't built to celebrate the freeing of the serfs or any of his other reforms. No, it was built on the exact spot where his blood stained the snow, a monument not to his life's work, but to his violent death. So in the end, the assassination completely backfired. That first step towards a constitution was thrown out immediately by his son Alexander III, and instead of getting more freedom, Russia got the opposite. It entered a period of intense autocracy, secret police, and crackdowns, which you could argue set the stage perfectly for the even more violent revolutions of 1905 and 1917. And that leaves us with this really tough question at the end of it all. The story of Alexander II, the great reformer who was killed by revolutionaries, it forces us to ask, can a leader ever truly control the change they start from the top? Or does opening that door to reform, even just a crack, inevitably unleash forces and expectations that just grow too big to handle, eventually consuming the very people who started it all?